special privilege for me today to be here to introduce formally one of the first individuals who welcomed Lynn and I to Rhode Island in June of 2009 when we arrived was Congressman Patrick Kennedy, who made it clear then that he was very, very interested in finding ways to build upon the strengths of the University of Rhode Island to advance the capabilities of the state and the quality of life of all Rhode Islanders. And I have to tell you, Congressman, that although we were already committed to come to URI, that once she met you, my wife made it clear that there was absolutely no thought of ever reversing that decision or going back to Montana, because she said, I want to live in a state where Patrick Kennedy is my congressman. And I think what she saw and what I've seen, and I think all of you have seen, is that in Congressman Kennedy, you have the very rare, and I think troublingly for all of us as Americans, increasingly rare conjunction of someone who is devoted to making a difference, a positive difference in the lives of people, both as a politician, but also someone who is a very deep and visionary thinker about how to accomplish that and how that is different than the usual kind of partisan political battles that I think is so troubling for all of us today. Congressman Kennedy has distinguished himself throughout his career as someone who could see what's coming next, as someone who could anticipate what the challenges of the future were going to be and how the United States needed to respond to those challenges. And he's done that extraordinarily well in all of the areas upon which neuroscience touches. He has established himself as a leader in having the country confront the implications both of traumatic brain injury as well as inherited neurological disorders, about the necessity of providing equity in treatment and diagnosis to all of Americans to deal with those problems, and the importance of fundamental as well as clinical research in building the capacity to deal with the mental health and neurological issues of the future. He has established himself as a visionary leader in those areas. He has devoted himself, particularly now, as a co-founder of One Mind for Research, of finding new solutions to problems which have bedeviled humanity since our origins. And that we're now, for the first time perhaps in our entire history as a species, in a position to actually proactively do something to address those problems that we've struggled with for so long. So it's a special personal privilege for me, and a special privilege for me as the president of the University of Rhode Island, as part of launching our new interdisciplinary program in neuroscience, to welcome today Congressman Patrick Kennedy. We look forward so much to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, President Dooley, and congratulations on your ascendancy to the presidency of URI, one of the truly fantastic state universities in all the 50 states. Let's hear it for URI! So I came on campus today and I saw the signs, "Think big, we do." And so that, I think, would be an appropriate intro to my topic of discussion today, because it really requires us to think big. And I see former President Carruthers here, and I want to thank him for his many years of service as URI president. And I see Bob Wagan. So he is, I know him as a colleague of mine in Congress. We served together, And the benefit I had over Bob was that even though he was older than me, I was his senior in Congress. And I just held that over him constantly, to the point where he finally said, I have to give up, I got to retire. But seriously, we had a chance to visit out front. We are so lucky to have had people like Congressman Wagon not only give to this state as lieutenant governor and make an enormous difference in our state, but I served with him also in the state legislature, but that he continues his service through public education of the highest sort through URI. So Bob, it's really great seeing you, and thank you for being here today. Now, you saw me hug this great older gentleman, but he's young at heart. Frank DePollo was born in 1906. Yeah, and he still has that on his driver's license because he still drives. When Teddy Roosevelt was, the San Juan Hill, Frank DePollo was born. That's his span of life. And I was lucky to have Frank help me when I first ran for public office because he knew everybody in the neighborhood where I first ran for state representative. And Bob could tell you, as well as others, that all politics is local. And so ultimately, the success of all of us who were fortunate enough to be in public life was based upon how well we got great grassroots support from people like Frank DePollo. Frank DePollo owned the largest diner in my district. So everybody came to him every morning for a cup of coffee and a sandwich. And he traded that for me for their goodwill to help me in my campaign, because when he said, I'm supporting Patrick Kennedy, that helped put me over the top. Because people think I got elected because of my last name being Kennedy. I can tell you I got elected because Frank DePollo in Mount Pleasant said that I was all right, and that's what made the difference. So I love you, Frank. You're my man. I want to thank everybody who's helped organize this. There's so many to acknowledge, but Lisa, Wyan, for all of your great work and putting this together. And Nasser, when you had that Rick Perry moment for a second, when you were like, and what was that other university that was supportive? You reminded me of a recent presidential debate with one of our... Anyway, I want to thank all of you for your interest in this subject. I believe, frankly, that the biggest opportunity for our state economically, because we're in a huge recession, our state suffered from job loss practically not only for more, but longer, practically than any other state in the country, that we need to think strategically about not only creating jobs for tomorrow, but jobs for tomorrow as in a generation from now, and moving forward between now and then, as to how do we create enough jobs that can sustain our economy. And I always in politics like things that I could get credit for numerous times. So I like two-fers and three-fers. So the two-fer and three-fer in this is that if we got into neuroscience the way we've already been involved with it, but if we got to brand ourselves as a state to being a center of excellence in neuroscience, we are going to be at the forefront of all of the most enhanced funding around the world. Because we have to keep in mind that it's hard. I know it's hard for Rhode Island to think out of its own borders. But we got to think not only nationally, how are we going to be part of this campaign, but internationally. Because if we create a center of excellence that is multidisciplinary, as President Dooley said, then what we end up doing is putting Rhode Island on the map globally. Now, I know there's no money for anything out there anymore. Everything's getting cut. but there is a wave of demographic changes, meaning the world is getting older, not only our country, but Europe and China. And the challenges of this demographic boom is higher rates of dementia, among many other things. And the necessity for us to try to track a way to minimize, treat, or even cure dementia, Alzheimer's, is going to be the holy grail of medical research. And its economic impact is not only going to be felt in how we minimize the cost of taking care of people with Alzheimer's, but it's going to be about how do we, as Rhode Island, play a role in coming up with that cure and those therapies in a way that lets us be the beneficiary of all of those dollars that are going to go into this area of research. And I know everybody's cutting money, but at the end of the day, as Nasser pointed out so well, everybody's affected by a brain-based illness. Whether it's your child with autism, your grandparent with Alzheimer's, or your sister or brother with Parkinson's, or with depression, or with addiction, there's really, everything is interconnected to how we understand the brain. And even things like cardiovascular disease is impacted dramatically by your brain health. And even things like diabetes is impacted dramatically by behavioral health, which means you need to understand how the brain works. So you remember, well, some of you may not have remembered, but Bob and I do. We were around when Bill Clinton was coming up with his standard message for the campaign. And he said, it's the economy, stupid. And I guess in this election, it's once again, as it always is, going to be the economy, stupid. But frankly, I'm here to tell you that I think it's going to be the brain, stupid. Because the economy rests on our understanding of the brain. You hear everybody talk in Washington now about how are we going to tackle entitlement spending. The costs of taking care of everybody who's growing old are going to sink our country and the world in a sea of red ink. We cannot afford to pay for everybody that's going to need care from Alzheimer's alone, let alone take care of everybody else who's suffering from a brain-based illness. So it's not about whether we would like to do this. We need to do this. It's about survival. And frankly, in order to be successful in this effort, we need to be smart. I know that sounds very simplistic, but political science is what neuroscience needs the most today. Because you can be studying developmental disabilities like autism, or you can study dementia, or you can study spinal cord injury, or you can study MS. You can study all of these things, but what you're really studying is the nervous system. You're really studying just the brain. It's the brain that unites everything. And yet the research in America that goes on today is really fueled by disease-centric approach. In Washington, I served on the NIH committee. There are 13 separate institutes at the NIH that study the brain. 13. Now, one of those 13 is named after my aunt Eunice Shriver, because my aunt Rosemary had a developmental disability. And you all know, because URI is the host of the URI State Games for Special Olympics, that Eunice Shriver started the Special Olympics. But in addition to starting the Special Olympics, she started what was known as the National Institute on Childhood and human development. In other words, she wanted to study birth defects because she wanted to study what it was that caused her sister to have a developmental disability and what it was that was going to help treat and better protect her sister. The point I'm making is she was personally invested in this. But it is ironic because what the NICHD, National Institutes for Childhood and Human Development, ultimately studied was Down syndrome. One of the principal effects of Down syndrome is dementia. Now, if any of you have family members with Alzheimer's, you know we've been making a lot of progress on Alzheimer's research. There's actually a National Institute on Aging that studies aging in the brain. But guess where all of the discoveries took place for Alzheimer's? Not in the Institute on Aging, but the Institute on Children. Isn't that a paradox? That to understand how to treat our grandparents, we needed to first understand how to treat our children. And it was the research that we did on Down syndrome at the Children's Institute that ultimately provided the foundational understanding of dementia that migrated over to the Institute on Aging. Here's my point. My point is that when you study any part of the brain, you're going to find things about other parts of the brain that you never knew you were going to find. And that for our political process to organize research in such a narrow, siloed way limits the full applicability of that science and the benefit of that science, because you don't have people looking at the science from a perspective as to how that science impacts other potential cures and treatments for other brain-based disorders. So another analogy. I got married, I moved to New Jersey because my wife's a public school teacher there, and she's the only one in my family with a job. So someone said to me there, who happens to have grandchildren in Rhode Island, they said to me, Patrick, how are you going to get the Autism Speaks group to join forces with the Alzheimer's Foundation and to join forces with the veterans for traumatic brain injury and to join forces with those addiction folks and those mental health folks? I said, that's a great question. I said, when you go visit your grandchildren in Rhode Island, do you take the interstate highway or do you take the back roads? And she said, well, of course, Congressman, I take the interstate because that gets me there faster. I said, hey, doesn't it make sense? The brain is our highway system of basic science. Our off-ramps for New Jersey, for Connecticut, for Rhode Island are mere exits off the highway of basic science, the interstate of basic science. Now, if I want to get to addiction or depression, I'm going to travel down this highway just as much as I'm going to travel down this highway to get to the answer for autism, just as much as I'm going to travel down this highway to get to the off-ramp of Alzheimer's. You see, we all need to be on that highway in order to get to where we want to go faster, even if for some of us, the off-ramp exit may come sooner than later. The more we combine our efforts, the quicker we're going to get to where we ultimately want to go, and the more effectively we're going to get there with the answers. Because it's all the brain, stupid. It's all basic science that's going to create the big science that's going to map out where our exits are. So when my aunt Eunice started research, now named after her, at the National Institutes for Childhood and Human Development, how could she have ever known that her husband, Sarge Shriver, my uncle, was going to die of Alzheimer's? How could she have ever known that her 5 children would all worry every day now whether they're going to get Alzheimer's? And how could she ever have known that by fighting for her sister Rosemary, she was going to be part of answering a scientific challenge that was going to help her 5 children and their children? That's the issue. We don't know where we're going until we all go there together and start to map out how all of our science informs each other's research. And now when you and I think of science, we think of someone looking through a microscope, a laboratory, a cubicle. What we're trying to do with One Mind for Research is to take all those cubicles, to take all those dots, and start to connect the dots. And how do you connect the dots? You take a 30,000-foot picture of something and you get to see it in more perspective. You get to see, as someone says, the forest from the trees. And if we can map out all the research in Parkinson's, guess what? We'll understand the dopamine receptors, and that will help us understand how to treat addiction. When we research traumatic brain injury and its impact, we're going to find out how to treat other impacts of neurological disorders that are precipitated by concussions. And what football players are facing is the same thing that hockey players are facing, is the same thing that soccer players are facing, is the same thing as Lou Gehrig faced when he took a number of fastballs to the head and ultimately got ALS. You're going to see a whole series of disorders impacted when we start doing the basic science in a way that's going to yield results for everybody. But we need to get the money and the energy and the urgency behind this campaign. So, as I spoke to Bob before coming in here, I said it's a new world after you leave Congress. Nobody returns your phone calls anymore. Okay? So I was trying to think of in fact, I love this audience because I've been going through withdrawal. And having a bunch of people listen to me is finally making my juices pump again. I'm thinking, maybe I ought to get back into this business of politics. But seriously, what we need is political science to inform neuroscience. We need to have a campaign. Now, as members of Congress, Bob and I would get lobbied all the time. So we'd have someone come up and say, this is my 10-point plan, this is what I need. And someone else go, this is my 10-point plan. Well, at the end of the day, when Bob and I could figure out that enough people came to us with the same 10 points, we started to see the politics. Because we started to see, oh my God, there are a lot of people who think the same way, and they're going to vote that way, and oh my God, we better be responsive. But when Autism Speaks go up to Capitol Hill, and Alzheimer's Foundation, and addiction, and depression, and then you got the veterans who have traumatic brain injury and PTSD come up, everybody's got their own agenda. And you know how you make it really easy for a member of Congress to say no? Is you find someone who contradicts them. And if you find enough people disagreeing, then we say, hey, listen, this is too complicated. I'm going to do something where everybody's in agreement, because that's safer for me politically. I want to make it safe politically for us to do neuroscience. But as you all know, one of the challenges of doing neuroscience is that it's often stigmatized because people have all kinds of myths and prejudices towards illnesses of the brain, because the way they manifest themselves is often behaviorally. And when someone acts strange, we call them crazy. We call them wacko. We call them nuts. We call them mental. It's pejorative. Who amongst us wants to be in that crowd? Nobody. So the challenge for us is to how do you get people to organize politically to be supportive of neuroscience when everybody doesn't want to raise their hand and say, yes, my family member had Alzheimer's. My family member had Down syndrome. My family member has ADHD, addiction, depression. You name it. It's a lot easier for people to come to Washington and say, today, oh, I had cancer, than it was 30 years ago. But we need to make the same change politically if we want to see the resources follow our intentions in terms of fund neuroscience. So I was, getting some briefings by people that probably President Dooley and others probably set up for me from neuroscience community. And they kept telling me that the brain is the last medical frontier. I know that doesn't ring a bell for you, but I happened to go to a meeting right after one of these briefings, to a meeting that I was on the board of the John F. Kennedy Performing Arts Center. This was about 2 years ago. And right after I had this meeting where these neuroscientists said the brain is the last medical frontier, I had the director of the Kennedy Center say, next year we're going to celebrate the new frontier. And I'm like, whoa, what's that got to do with anything? They said, well, as you know, like I'm supposed to know, because I was born after my uncle was president and killed. President Kennedy's whole term in office and period in American history is called the New Frontier. So I said, wow, and a politician, the light went off in my head, wow, maybe I can get this New Frontier thing connected, and we can say that the new frontier for today is the last medical frontier. It's the brain. So I called up my cousin Caroline. I said, Caroline, January 20th? Yes, it's 50 years since your father was sworn in as president. She said, yeah, I know, Patrick. Yeah, and I was thinking maybe we could get a bunch of neuroscientists together at the John F. Kennedy Library and celebrate this as the new frontier for today. She said, Patrick, thanks a lot, but we've already got a program organized. We've got the President of the United States, we've got everybody involved. And I'm like, ugh. And then Caroline said to me this. She said, if you want to use the library on the anniversary of President Kennedy's moonshot speech, I'm happy letting you use it. And I said, terrific, because we want to go to inner space, not outer space. And the neuroscientists today are astronauts of today. And she said, great, go to it. So as I told you, no one would return my phone calls because I'm a former member of Congress. But when I could invite them to the John F. Kennedy Library for the anniversary of the moonshot speech, when my uncle said, before the decade was out, we're going to put a man on the moon, return him safely. May 25, 1961. And then we ended up doing it in 1969. It represented one of the truly remarkable scientific achievements that we've ever known. And so I invited all these neuroscientists saying that the next frontier today is brain science. And guess what? They all came. I got all the NIH directors of the sub-institutes, HOTUS, Volkow, INSUL, Landis. I got the principal NIH, Francis Collins, he came. I got the head of the FDA come. I didn't get the president, but I got Vice President Biden because the president was over in Europe. They all wanted to be there because they loved that metaphor that's so powerful in the American imagination of us being able to achieve a goal that we set out to achieve. And so then I talked to a guy named Dan Goldin, who was in charge of NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And he said, Patrick, I was a college student in '61, and when your uncle said that we'd go to the moon, I knew, I was studying the rocket scientist back then. He said, nobody believed that we could do it within a decade. They said that's too far-fetched. Yes, we'll be able to orbit the Earth. Yes, we'll get better, maybe, vehicles, but this notion of actually putting an astronaut on the moon, landing them there, and bringing them back, everybody thought that President Kennedy was really over his skis. But because he said that we were going to do it, we ended up doing it. And how did we do it? We did it because everybody was pulled together for a common cause. In other words, you needed to take the people that were in charge of the capsule and get them to talk to the people who are in charge of the rocket launch, and the people who were in charge of gravity, and the people that were in charge of all the inboard systems on the capsules. Everybody needed to work together. So I thought this would be a good metaphor, and it's turned out to be a terrific metaphor. Because the real thing that we discovered, among many others, when we went to outer space, is we had to build systems, computer systems. People talk about, where the internet came from. It was really propelled in large measure to the space race, because we needed to take large amounts of data and integrate that data with lots of other forms of data so as to know what we were doing. And we created the supercomputer. So what we discovered as a result of going to outer space, the supercomputer, is today what's going to allow us to go to inner space. Because the thing that makes today different than 10 years ago when we started the decade of the brain is that today we have the tools to go to inner space like we've never had before. So when we talk about this thing called neuroscience, we could always talk about it, we could make some discoveries, but we were really limited in the absolute amount of discovery that we could make because we didn't have the tools. So the other tools we have are the human genome, which gives us all the genetic markers to tell us why some people get Alzheimer's and some people don't, why some children get autism and some don't, why some people get MS and some don't, or why some people get a depression or have problems with addiction and some people don't. So the genome is now with us. We can do the genome of the brain. Now we have other things, other tools like imaging. So before we went to outer space, we had telescopes. We have telescopes now for the brain. fMRIs and PET scans. They're revolutionizing the way we look at the brain. You could never get through the skull to the brain before. Now you can. This imaging technology is fantastic. And we have supercomputers. We have things like IBM Watson, which is like challenging people on Jeopardy, right? We have to put them together and understand how do we connect the dots. Because at the end of the day, what's informed a lot of discovery in healthcare is what's known as an epidemiological-like approach, which is population-based information. Gives us more data that allows us to be able to better focus on where the targets of opportunity are. Well, with supercomputing, we can input the data on Parkinson's, with the data on Alzheimer's, with the data on addiction, with the data on traumatic brain injury. We can take data here and data there and let that supercomputer spit out some algorithms that will help us determine where the best opportunities of treating one of these disorders is. Because the answer in one of these disorders may be found in science from some other part of the brain. And what's going to allow us to see all that science? A 30,000-foot approach, a computer model that's able to map out where all the patterns are and recognize where there's patterns. What will that allow all of us to do? It'll allow us to target where we're going to do the research. And so if you know where you're going, you get there a lot faster. I heard the phrase that, the wife asked the husband who was driving and seemingly did not know where he was going, do you know where you're going? He said, no, but I'm sure making good time. So we're spending a lot of money and going a lot of places in neuroscience. But if we don't know where we're going, we're not going to make the most of it. We're not going to be able to connect what we learn to something else that someone learned that helps validate what we learned and be able to paint the picture. So it's like a jigsaw puzzle. We need to put all the pieces in place. And that means we're going to have to get everybody to be part of this. So I talked to this guy named Chuck Schwab. There's actually a guy named Chuck Schwab. So I went in and I saw him. Hey, hi, Chuck. They told me that I better talk to you. Get that? Talk to Chuck? Okay. So I said, Chuck, we're trying to do this thing, bring everybody together, get people to support us. And he said, Patrick, I love the idea. He said, are you going to have some more Republicans there? Because he saw my list of people and he thought they looked kind of liberal and democratic. So he said, you're going to have some Republicans there? I said, Chuck, we're not partisan to anything other than the brain and how to get the cures. And last time I checked, you can't tell a disorder is a Republican disorder or a Democratic disorder. Everybody gets these illnesses. And so we all have a national interest in this. So if you recall from your history books, and some of you I see in the audience actually were around in 1961, there was this thing called Sputnik. It's what led us to the race to the moon, because the Russians were really making great progress. Their Sputnik, they launched Sputnik before we were able to get to space. So it challenged us. I said, I think the Sputnik that's going to get everybody to really get motivated is the fact that our American heroes, our veterans, the people after 9/11, who were like the people that ran into those burning buildings while the rest of us were running out of those buildings. The people who put their hands up to go over to Iraq and Afghanistan and other parts of the world to keep another 9/11 from happening on our soil. These extraordinary Americans are our heroes. And all of us as Americans owe them an enormous debt of gratitude. And the signature wound of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq is traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, if you want to organize a way of describing everything from Alzheimer's to autism, you can put it all under the banner of traumatic brain injury. Because understanding traumatic brain injury in all its manifestations is really the same as saying, I'm going to do research in Alzheimer's, I'm going to do research in autism. It's the same deal. Post-traumatic stress disorder, what's that? That includes depression, anxiety, addiction. So you put all of those disorders under PTSD, and you've pretty much covered the rest of brain-based illnesses. So you put TBI and PTSD together, you've got everything under the sun. So when I talk to people to get them to sign on to this, I usually have a couple of people with me. And one of them is a guy named Kit Parker. He's a Rhode Island National Guard, and he stands about 6'8". Okay, yeah, it makes a huge impact. He did 3 tours of duty in Iraq, and he was a medic. So after the rocket-propelled grenade would hit the convoy, he would be in charge of going and dragging out of the Humvee all of his wounded. And he was the guy who was the first responder. But he said to me, you know, Patrick, he said, whether one of my guys was hit and he died the day that he got hit from an RPG, or whether he died because of an IED, an improvised explosive device, that day, or whether 5 years later he comes down with a dreaded neurological disorder because of the concussion and the brain injury that he suffered that day, he said, and then he takes his own life because he can't stand and bear to live with the symptoms of trauma or traumatic brain injury. To me, he said, this is Kid Parker talking, that's a win for the terrorist. That's a casualty of war. He said, Congressman, we don't give them Purple Hearts, even though their brains are injured. Because when people can't see it on the outside, they don't believe it exists on the inside. And I said, Kit, that's the fight that anybody who's ever suffered from a mental illness has always fought. We add insult to injury when you have a brain-based disorder. Because it's not enough that you're suffering from a very real physiological wound. You now have the insult to injury, which is that we're going to marginalize you and treat you like a pariah in society. Because you act funny, you act weird, you act nuts, you act crazy. And who wants to be in that group? So the challenge here is how do we make the invisible wounds of war visible? And I believe when we do that for our soldiers, we're going to do that for all Americans who suffer from comparable brain-related disorders. But what's going to get Congress to vote for more money when they've got a million other priorities is that there's no greater priority for our nation than to be there for the veterans that were there for us. And if you look at, if you're political science and you look at history, what has always galvanized the American public, what actually built our national highway system, was called the Cold War. That's what Eisenhower used in order to get the interstate highway system. What built the nuclear program, the Manhattan Project, was national security. What ultimately enabled us to do anything we sought to do was to put it through the paradigm of national security. And frankly, it is national security. Not only because we need to save our soldiers, but we need to save all Americans who suffer from these disorders. So I'll conclude with saying that the soldiers, they fought terrorism. But you know, anybody who suffers from dementia or developmental disability or a stigmatizing disorder like depression or addiction, they're terrorized by the thought that anybody would know that they suffer from this. All right? Now, when I got a lot of press because I had addiction, believe me, they put it on the front pages of the paper. But when I went and saw a doctor for my other chronic illness called asthma, none of the press wrote about it. I wonder why. Because this illness is stigmatized. This illness is not. And ultimately, in order for us to get the science done right, we've got to address this thing called discrimination and stigma. Now, President Kennedy did something else that was pretty amazing. He was the first president to address civil rights as a president. And he said, who amongst us would trade places with someone else and be content with the counsels of patience and delay? So today people say to me, it's going to take 20, 30 years before we find out how the brain works. It's too long, too much time. It's too complex, too difficult. You know what Dr. King said? He said, if you walked a mile in my shoes, if you were locked up in prison because of the color of your skin like I was, you'd want to change the laws tomorrow. And the fact is, there are people in this society who are still discriminated on race, on gender, on a whole litany of reasons. But they're also discriminated persistently because they suffer from a brain-based disorder. And they're marginalized. And I'm not proud to say that even while I was the sponsor of mental health parity, which basically said the brain was part of the body, that only was passed 2 years ago, by the way. The United States of America said the brain was part of the body 2 years ago. I know, it's funny. But if it had been another organ of the body, do you think it would have taken that long for us to pay for treatment for people with brain-based disorders? I don't think so. So we discriminate against these people. And if it was you or your loved one, you know that you're not willing to sit on your hands and wait 20, 30 years for an answer, when we could have the answer well within our lifetime, provided we have the political will. So we have the tools, we know what to do. What's the missing piece? The missing piece is political will. It's that rocket fuel that's going to blast this moonshot to the mind off and bring us all home to successfully live in a world that all of us would like for our loved ones who suffer from these brain-based disorders. So that has been the animating principle behind our campaign. And I haven't found a person out there who said no. We've gotten all the NIH directors. We've had the President of the United States. He's working on something with the First Lady called joining forces for our veterans. We're going to be part of that in the coming year. All of the pharmaceutical industry is interested in participating with us because they know none of them can do it alone. They're better off if they work to try to do things together that none of them has to do individually and pay for individually. So if they pool their investment, everybody becomes a winner. Now, if you want to win the lottery, you can buy one ticket, or you can buy 20 tickets. When all of you collect and go in on a pool, you increase your odds. Let's increase our odds. Let's pool and buy a lot of lottery tickets, you know, because I know how much we love gaming, right? We want to hit that Powerball. And let's invest in the thing that's going to really make huge returns for all of us in our lives, and that's taking care of the people we love. Thank you very, very much.